might kind of initially have thought, once I get diagnosed, that's kind of the end of that effortful, long journey. Actually, what happens then is that you start in the next step of that journey, in the next step of that process, right? So now you need to kind of come to terms, accept that ADHD is part of who you are, part of your identity. And that can sometimes be really difficult, especially if you weren't sure beforehand whether you had ADHD, etc. But even in those circumstances where you're actually quite convinced or quite certain, even before you get that official diagnosis, that you meet criteria for inattentive ADHD, it can still be a really long kind of emotional process to kind of come to terms with it and really accept that, right? It's no different from accepting any other kind of health related diagnosis or social kind of environment, social situation kind of diagnosis. I know that's not strictly speaking a diagnosis, but kind of it's the same logic, right? Like a divorce or a separation or starting a new relationship, they all require adjustment, right? And they all require a period of adjusting to this new information and this new way of being. Same applies for if we would get a diagnosis of, say, diabetes, right? I'm in no way comparing ADHD and diabetes, but there are some similarities, right? They both restrict us in certain ways. They mean that we have certain kind of limitations that we need to live with, or that we need to kind of find adaptive strategies for coping with and thriving with, right? At the same time, people with diabetes have lots of strengths, right? And people with ADHD, with inattentive ADHD, have lots of strengths as well. So it's also a whole process to kind of not swing too far in that direction of thinking, oh, we only have limitations, we only have weaknesses, right? The ADHD diagnosis, hopefully, if you've been supported well, has helped you make sense of certain struggles that you have encountered in your life at an ongoing basis. And hopefully, it will kind of allow you to have a more coherent story about yourself, right? Have a more coherent narrative in terms of what are those things that you're good at, what are those things that you struggle with, and how kind of have they played out throughout your history, right? And how will they likely factor into your future in one way or another. One thing that's really important to keep in mind is that, yes, your inattentive ADHD diagnosis is real. It's not imagined, right? The health professional that has seen you, they have likely put in care and effort. They have likely seen a lot of people with inattentive ADHD in their lifetime, so they have a lot of comparison points. And if they diagnosed you with ADHD, it's very unlikely that that diagnosis was made in error. So really you can trust that you do meet criteria for an inattentive ADHD diagnosis. And it's very normal to feel like, oh, but maybe I'm not affected enough to qualify for a diagnosis. Maybe it's not severe enough. Maybe the negative elements of my ADHD are not serious enough. They're not the same as other people I know with inattentive ADHD. But none of those things are reasons as to why you wouldn't be able to meet criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. In fact, it's very common for clients and coaching clients to report that they think like, oh, maybe it's not bad enough. Maybe I'm not affected severely enough to meet a diagnosis, right? So trust that if you have been diagnosed with ADHD, then there are those parts of the ADHD that impact you very negatively. right? That's not your whole identity, and that's not all that ADHD is, because ADHD also comes with strengths, right? And there's still a lot of research that needs to be done in those areas. But one very obvious strength is hyperfocus, right? So if someone with inattentive ADHD, like yourself, gets really interested, gets really into something, right, you can often focus really well and for extended periods of time. You can often focus much better and for much longer than people without inattentive ADHD, right? So don't overlook those strengths, but at the same time try to acknowledge those limitations. Try to acknowledge those challenges, right, that ADHD presents you with. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people who feel like, and this is very common as well, who feel like, oh, it's all hopeless. The struggles that I'm confronted with, those limitations that pop up as part of my ADHD in organization, in focusing, in distractibility, etc., they're so strong, they're so severe, and they affect me so much in my day-to-day life, and they really have impeded my performance in school, my performance at work. They impact me in my social life, etc., etc., right? So that's the other end of the spectrum, which is very common as well. Please don't feel like it's hopeless, right? ADHD objectively is associated with impairments in executive functioning, impairments in planning, impairments in attention, etc. And they're very real impacts on what we call adaptive functioning. So that basically refers to our functioning in daily life in different domains like self-care, social relationships, school, work, hobbies, etc. ADHD negatively influences adaptive functioning as a group, right? So if we take a group of people with inattentive ADHD and we take a group of people without any inattentive ADHD, what we see is that the group of people with inattentive ADHD without supports struggles more in adaptive functioning than that non-ADHD healthy control group, right? That, however, does not mean that we can't further grow and we can't develop our skills and capabilities further if we fall into that inattentive ADHD group, right? So when you look at the research, what we can see is that people with inattentive ADHD can learn to plan better. They can learn to be more focused on the task at hand that they want to focus on. They can learn to bounce back from distractions more quickly and more reliably, right? None of these skills change dramatically from one day to the next, right? All of these things require extended effort and extended practice, but it really is possible to enhance our planning skills, to enhance our focus skills, to enhance our attentional focus. So what I would like you to do at this point in time is to sit down and to think about two strengths that you exhibit. So think about yourself. This doesn't necessarily have to be ADHD related, but please write down two strengths that you are very happy with in yourself, right? Two things that you're proud of, that make you you. And then once you have done that, you can pause the video. Once you've done that, you can then think about what are two limitations or two kind of structural barriers that you have to work with due to your ADHD, right? So what are those two things that you really struggle with? So one thing that's really important is to really think about ourselves as a balanced package of strengths and limitations, right? And sometimes we get dealt a kind of more difficult set of cards to work with, right? One hand that you've been dealt with is your inattentive ADHD, right? So that's a more challenging set of cards to win with or to work with than having a super high focus, super high organizational inherent ability kind of set of cards, right? However, it doesn't mean that you can't win or that you can't do well with this set of cards that you have in hand, right? The ADHD cards. Because importantly, you, with this game that we're playing, every round you pick up a new card and put away one of the cards that you no longer want, right? So that is akin to learning or developing our skills, right? So even though you start out with a more kind of difficult set of cards to let you win with, if you pick up consistently cards that are at the very least okay, right? And then you put away the cards that are most challenging one by one, you over time increase your ability to work well with those cards that you have in hand, right? You have limitations, right? And some of those limitations are directly related to your inattentive ADHD. And that's a difficult kind of hand of cards to have been dealt in some degree, right? It's very realistically, in very real ways, impacts you at work, impacts you in the home environment, impacts you in terms of planning, impacts you in terms of maybe past academic achievements, etc., right? So that's really real, and it's important that you acknowledge that to yourself, that you acknowledge that while some other people have ran the 100 meters just by themselves and they've been quite fast, you have run the 100 meters with a tire that you're dragging behind you, right? So obviously you've had to put in more effort to progress to the same degree. And congratulate yourself on that, right? Congratulate yourself on all those things that you have achieved with those real, very realistic, real barriers that you have to work with. At the same time, really acknowledge that you have many strengths. So it's absolutely not hopeless. ADHD is not the end all. There are many people with inattentive ADHD who thrive, right? And who go on to do amazing and awesome things. And I'm sure that when you look carefully in your past, you will see lots of amazing things that you've done, right? Whether that's in terms of social interactions or academic achievements, experiences where you have pushed through and kind of done really well in the end. And I guess the final important thing is that you can grow, right? So never forget that you can grow, that you can enhance your skills, and that you can get better at those things that you're struggling with. So I would in general kind of suggest, again, a bit of a balanced approach, right? So on the one hand, you want to draw on your strengths, right? So make the most of your strength. So if you're a very social person, perhaps working in a job where that's really valued is a really sensible thing, right? You also want to work on your limitations or on those things that are holding you back at the moment, right? And those are all skills, so executive functioning skills, as are often mentioned in the domain of inattentive ADHD, for example. They are less well developed in people with inattentive ADHD. And that's not because you have done something wrong, not at all. It's just you have been dealt with a neurobiological card where those skills have been kind of less ready to develop, less eager to develop, right? And so what you can do on the limitations front is really focus on one or a couple of those skills and those domains, and really work on becoming stronger in those areas as well. And I will be posting some videos in the coming weeks, and I'll be running some free webinars as well that will talk about what domains it makes sense to work on in terms of those limitations, and further developing those skills that are related to executive functioning in inattentive ADHD. So my take-home messages really are, you're not imagining it, it's not in your head, it's real, right? You're running into barriers that are real, you're running into struggles that are real. To acknowledge that to yourself, it's important, right? Not to gaslight yourself, to be supportive towards yourself. So say, look, I've been confronted with some real struggles, right? And very hopeful. You have lots of strengths, and you can also work on those limitations, those ADHD related limitations, right? Those are all skills that can be further developed, that can be enhanced further, and where you can find ways to work with it as best as you can.